Welcome back to the last aspect of the magisterial reforms that I want to talk about. So we have discussed Martin Luther, the posting of the 95 Theses in 1517 as the sort of historical beginning of the active period of the Reformation, and Zwingli and Calvin being two elements of the Church of the Protestant Reform. And by the way, if you are of a Reformed tradition or Presbyterian, you are a descendant of that Calvin branch of the Protestant Reform. Now, the Reformation in England is also a magisterial reform, but it takes place in a very, very different way. And it begins with this man, Henry VIII. So Henry VIII, the King of England, famous for his wives, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Henry VIII was very much in search of a male heir to the throne. So he ends up his first marriage, and basically a happy one for many years, was to a woman named Catherine of Aragon, who was actually his older brother's wife. But his older brother died and he married Catherine. And they were married for well over a decade. But Catherine was not able to produce a male heir. So Catherine, her child, she had one child that survived to adulthood, and that is Mary Tudor. So Catherine is the mother of Mary. But Henry wants a son really badly. And so he decides to get an annulment. So here's the difference between an annulment and a divorce. So if, by the way, marriage in the Roman Catholic Church is a sacrament, which means that it actually brings grace to the believers. So it is equal to baptism or communion or confession in the spiritual role it plays in the life of the believer. Protestants do not believe this. So you can't get a divorce in the Roman Catholic Church because you were married under God. And so a divorce, I mean, he could have divorced her, but then any further children he had would have been illegitimate in the eyes of the church. And he couldn't have that because he wanted a male heir without any question about the legitimacy of the child. So he sends off, basically, the reform in England starts because Henry VIII wants a divorce from his wife, Catherine of Aragon. And by the way, his dates are 1509 to his 1547. So he is very much an adult during, the time of the first wave of the Reformation. So he looks across the pond, so to speak, and to the European continent and says, hey, there are a bunch of people over there who are rejecting let me take a step back. He sends off his emissaries to the Vatican in Rome because if he can't get a divorce, but if the Pope declares that annuls his marriage, then what happens is the marriage, under the eyes of the church, the marriage never took place. So Mary would have become illegitimate, but any other children, the male that he wants, would be legitimate in the eyes of the church. So that's the difference between a divorce and an annulment. For a relatively powerful ruler, annulment wouldn't have been that hard to get. So he sends his emissaries off to the Pope in Rome. He's got one problem. Catherine of Aragon is by the way, Spanish princess. Much more important royal family than the English at this point. Her nephew is Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. Charles V controls the Pope. Literally, his armies surround the Vatican, and the Pope is not going to do anything that Charles V doesn't want him to do. So Henry's emissaries show up, ask for an audience with the Pope, and Charles makes sure that they never get to see him at all. There is no way that Charles V is going to allow his aunt to be divorced by some, what he would have thought was some podunk king from across the waters. Way more powerful of a man at this point. So Henry is stuck. He can't even ask the Pope because Charles won't let him. So then he's like, what do I do? Catherine is now too old to bear any more children. So he says, look at all these reform movements going on in continental Europe. They don't acknowledge the authority of the Pope. They reject the authority of the Pope. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to declare myself a Protestant nation, make myself the head of the church, set up a new church, and give myself an annulment. And hence is born the Church of England. So the Church of England, set up by Henry VIII, in order that he could get an annulment, declare his marriage to Catherine invalid, and therefore his next marriages, the children of his next marriages, legitimate. So the Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church, and it is then the Reformed Church of England, the Anglican Church, then whose the head is the king or queen. So Queen Elizabeth II is the current head of the Anglican Church in theory anyway. She doesn't obviously run it, but the Church of England, the head of the Church of England, is the reigning monarch of the time. So Henry VIII. He then, Catherine then is, marriage is annulled, and Catherine is sent off to live in retirement in the English countryside. So then he goes on. So Catherine is the first wife. So remember, divorced. So that marriage never took place. He then marries an English subject, an English woman, Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn, wife number 2, is only able to produce one child who survives to adulthood. This child is Elizabeth. We now think of her as Elizabeth I because there's now Elizabeth II. She's not producing a male heir either. The historians seem to think that she was charged with adultery and beheaded and condemned to death and beheaded, although most historians think that was just something that Henry VIII conjured up in order to get rid of her. Because now he's got another woman in his sights, another English subject, right? So he can do to these women what he couldn't do to the Spanish princess, Jane Seymour. She then is the only woman who bears Henry a male heir, Edward, who becomes Edward VII. Jane Seymour dies very young, so we got divorced, beheaded, died, and then the next 3 don't produce children, so we don't have to worry about them. So we move then to there's a minimal amount of change to the church in England. A lot of Henry's advisors are more interested in the Protestant reform than he is, and they put a lot of that in place. And so the church starts to move in the direction of a more Protestant look. So, but when Henry dies, he Edward the Sixth becomes the heir. Bear with me; it's a family story. So after his death, Edward the Seventh, was only 9 years old when he ascends to the throne, and dies before he reaches the age of 18. So the entire reign of Edward takes place so the nation is really being run by his advisors, the ones that were set up by Henry VIII, and they are very much interested in the Protestant movement. So you see a big shift towards reforming the church in England under Edward VI, including the first version of the Book of Common Prayer, which has become the fundamental document of the Anglican Church. And so, go back to that. So Edward, like I said, does not survive to adulthood. So now we are thrown into sort of chaos. There is no male heir. There's nothing that says a woman can't reign, but, there's a lot of turmoil. Mary Tudor is the one who is able to consolidate power and take over the throne. Now remember that she is Catherine's daughter, who has been dismissed in a very horrible way by her father, and she has been raised as a Roman Catholic. So for the few years of her reign, just a few years, she tries to return England to the Roman Catholic Church. This causes a lot of violence and bloodshed, and she is otherwise known as Bloody Mary for all the chaos that ensued by trying to return England to the Roman Catholic Church. So, but she does not live for very long. She dies young, and the next monarch is Elizabeth. Elizabeth, of course, now known as Elizabeth I, because we have the current queen, who is Elizabeth II. So Elizabeth I. She takes over in 1558 and reigns for a very long time, almost 40 years. This is the golden age of England. The Elizabethan age. We've got Shakespeare. We've got England going from being a backwater power to being the premier military, maritime power in the world. She just really takes the country in a very different direction. But she inherits a mess. But she has been raised a Protestant. So she then returns England back to Protestantism. So you go from Henry going from Roman Catholicism to Protestantism. Edward keeps it Protestant. Mary turns it back to Roman Catholic, and Elizabeth turns it back to Protestant country. She has to solve the religious problem before she can do much of anything else in England. And so a few years after she takes over, she issues something known as the Via Media, which means middle way in Latin. This was an edict surrounding the religious life of England. And it very much says what it is. England under Mary, as the Anglican Church really does exist today, is a combination of Protestant theology with a lot of the pomp and circumstances and liturgy of the Roman Catholic Church. So it'll look a lot like a Catholic church when you're going in, but underlying it is very Protestant. So she creates sort of an umbrella in this middle way that allows for the diverse forms of Christianity in England to sort of rest with each other. But she also then builds on what her brother has done by reissuing the Book of Common Prayer. The reason that this is so important, see the word common in it, is that any church in England on any given Sunday, you can walk in and know that the service is going to look more or less the same, because the Book of Common Prayer guides and designs all worship practices. So there are obviously alternatives. It's not a rote kind of thing, but every church in England will conduct its service from the Book of Common Prayer. So you go from church to church to church, it's all going to look familiar and the same. So again, it's a common place where everyone can come together. This then is basically what settles England down, and of course then her great political ability to bring England to the forefront as one of the major European powers of her day. So that's how the Reform occurred in England. This combination of idealism and practicality and discontent, and Henry's divorce, and all of what happens in between. So it's a very different movement. I would say then, one more thing about Elizabeth. At her death, she is known as the Virgin Queen. That's where the name Virginia comes from, the state of Virginia. Her designated heir is James of Scotland. So he becomes James I of England upon Elizabeth's death. He does contribute one very important document to the English-speaking Protestant world, and that is he's the one that commissions the King James Bible. So a Bible in English, standardized, like the Book of Common Prayer, for every English reader. So James I. One more thing. The Anglicans were very big in this country. A lot of the colonies that come from English background were settled by Anglicans. After the split between England and America, those churches could no longer be loyal to the monarch in England. So the Anglican Church in America is known as the Episcopalian Church, the Episcopals. So if you are English, you are Anglican. If you're an American who goes to a church that is a descendant of this movement, then you're an Episcopalian. So that's the Reformation in England.